Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization. Welcome to the first video in the series of Strength Training Made Simple. If you like these, but you're curious about how to enhance your muscle growth training, check out our other series of a very similar name, Hypertrophy Made Simple, and all of the other Made Simple series as playlists in our channel. So, Strength Training Made Simple, number 1, how to choose strength exercises. Here we go. The biggest principle in strength training is specificity, which means a couple of things. First of all, at the core of it, you train the lifts that are the ones you want to get stronger at, which means like if you want a bigger bench, the most straightforward and effective way usually to do that is to do lots of bench pressing. It's really pretty open and shut at that level. Here's the thing, not only do those lifts improve your strength the most by actually training with them, they're also the ones you're going to test with. So for example, can you get a bigger bench by doing dumbbell presses? Yes, but you're testing on the bench, you sort of might as well practice on it. It's like having a cheat sheet, which is the actual test you're going to take and working from the test to try to study from it. You know, you guys have been to school before. If you have a copy of the test to study with, that's amazing. And that's kind of like what having the actual lift in your program is like much of the time. So, that is fundamental at its core that we always have to remember. Now, that's not always the only way we have to be training, because you can train other lifts that tax the subsystems that support that major lift. For example, lifts that are of a similar pattern to the major lift usually carry over to enhance its strength. If you do a bench press, that's cool, but you can also train a flat press on a machine, flat dumbbell press, even a slight incline press. All mechanically are very similar to the bench and thus have a lot of carryover. So you don't necessarily only have to train bench or even have to train bench at all, but similar looking lifts are probably a really good idea as far as actually making that one lift you want to improve stronger. Now, another way to train for strength is doing lifts that grow or make stronger individual muscles or several muscles at a time involved in the actual lift you want to improve. So for example, if you want a bigger bench press, doing some skull crushers, right, for triceps is absolutely fine because your triceps will get bigger and stronger and that will contribute to a bigger bench because they're used in that actual bench press. So you absolutely can do that as well. And lastly, not just individual muscles, but portions of the lift, parts of the movement. If you have lifts that make those stronger individually, you can add them together and actually have a bigger lift. So for example, if you are trying to increase your squat strength, you can increase your leg press strength because the ability to extend your legs is a huge part of squatting. That movement, when it gets stronger, usually propels your squat. In addition to that, if you train lots of good mornings, the good morning by bending over at the hips is absolutely a big part, actually the other half of the squat movement. If your good morning goes up, all other things being equal, your squat will probably go up as well. So you can absolutely train component lifts for that bigger lift, which means you can train the lift itself, and that's great, but you don't just have to train the lift itself if it meets these subsystem criteria. So when you look at this, you can ask, okay, what are some objective criteria for exercise selection? How do I make this a little bit more of a checklist? And there's fundamentally 2 checklist items. One, specificity, which was just what we covered. Is the exercise the lift itself? If it is, great. Does the exercise that you want to consider putting in your program, secondly, does it train the muscles and movements that are limiting factors in the lift? Now, usually the lift meets those criteria, no problem, but so do a bunch of other lifts, right? At least one of these has to be a yes. If you want to increase your bench press and what you're going to be doing is a rear lateral raise with cables, someone can ask you like, hey, how does that help your bench? And if you can't obviously answer them in a way that you could explain to like your grandma, gee, you know, maybe you're not choosing the best possible lifts. So that's that. That's point number 1. So it's got to pass the specificity filter. Secondly is SFR, which is super simple, stimulus to fatigue ratio. Not that complicated of a concept, although we do have a couple of videos on our channel. If you type in Renaissance Periodization SFR, you actually get a video describing exactly what it is, especially for hypertrophy training. It's very similar for strength. Here's the deal. We choose lifts that do a couple of things for us. First, the exercise or the lift that we choose to train places high tension on the target muscle. Super, super important because strength is developed with high tension. Okay, if you want to increase the strength of your triceps, but you pick a lift that can't reliably impose high tension on the triceps, you have a problem, right? Now, the other question is, yes, can you apply tension to the target muscle? That's a good thing, but can you train this exercise safely and heavy at the same time? So there may be weird isolation lifts like lateral raises, for example. If you want strong shoulders, it's tough to lateral raise for sets of 3 to 6, which we'll cover later as the best rep range for enhancing your strength. So maybe that's not the best lift. But if you pick a lift, maybe an upright row or a shoulder press that allows you to go relatively heavy and safely, that's really, really awesome. So impose tension on the target muscles in a safe manner. Secondly, the exercise should feel grooved in, ideally after just a few sessions, not awkward. Okay, if you're awkward, if the exercise doesn't feel like you're really grooving with it and feel your own force production, you're not going to be able to produce really high forces. Some unstable exercises suffer from this. Sometimes people just aren't built really well for the lift. So if you've tried high bar squatting and it just feels terrible, if you go back to low bar squatting and it feels great and it feels like you're really producing a ton of tension and a ton of force, that's really awesome. Next concern, this is on the fatigue side. So those two are on the stimulus side. On the fatigue side, the exercise should probably not beat up your joints and connective tissues a ton. Why? Because we get stronger at exercises we can train for a while, at least weeks. If an exercise really beats the crap out of your joints and connective tissues, you're not going to be able to train it heavy for weeks because you're just going to peter out and have to quit because your knees or elbows or shoulders or whatever are going to be in pain, and that's going to be the dominant experience you have versus actually producing high levels of force. So if you try to hack squat and it just really, after a few sessions, just really doesn't do anything good to your knees, you might as well throw it out of your program. Maybe try leg presses and all of a sudden, boom, everything feels great. That's awesome. And lastly, the exercise shouldn't drain you a ton. To put it this way, it shouldn't drain you more than it increases your strength. For example, if you do deficit deadlifts, just as an example, and this is different for every single person, you might find from deficit deadlifts that you get incredible gains in strength. The exercise is super smooth, and yet it beats you up and it takes a lot out of you psychologically, but it's not the end of the world. You may also find that if you do rack pulls, super ultra heavy, you got to get crazy psyched up for them. After multiple sets of rack pulls, yeah, your strength is improving, but it feels like you're moving heaven and earth and it just beats you up neurologically, systemically, just at the core, drains you and interferes with the rest of your program. I don't know. If one of those lifts seems to be increasing in strength for you, but it doesn't tax you as much at a central level, it's probably the better choice. So that doesn't mean we avoid the super hardcore lifts that really drain us. It means if they're draining us, they have to be worth the effort. They have to impose a ton of tension on the target muscles, and they have to be improving our strength a lot to be justifiable. Now, not all exercise, you can find exercises that meet these criteria, but at some point they may no longer meet them if they become stale if you use them too long in your program. So how do we rotate exercises in and out over time? Super common question, actually with a pretty easy answer. You keep doing exercises that meet most of the following checklist items, and there's only 3. First, the exercise gives you great tension and lets you lift heavy loads in a relative good groove. So if you're doing low bar squats, you're lifting heavy, you feel grooved in, and everything's going well, there's probably no good reason to get rid of low bar squats. Secondly, if the exercise is easier on your joints, notice I said easier, not totally easy. Lifting for strength has effects on the joints that sometimes in the short term aren't great. In the long term, they usually make your joints stronger, but in the short term, they will beat them up a little bit. It just has to be easier on your joints than another alternative. So if low bar squats really beat up your back, but high bar squats don't beat it up at all or hardly at all, choosing high bar squats is a good idea. And the lift should be worth the systemic fatigue. Like, yeah, it beats you up a ton and makes you super tired, but it's also grooving really well, and you're putting more and more weight on the bar over time. And that's point number 3. If you're steadily climbing in strength over weeks and months in the lift, for the love of God, as long as your joints aren't breaking and the systemic fatigue isn't crazy, leave the lift in. If you meet all 3 checklist items, don't you dare take that lift out. Now, a super common question is like, well, my low bar squat meets these 3 criteria for like the last 3 years. Does that mean that yes, that means you can continue to low bar squat for 3 years and more and never take it out because it's awesome. Why would you stop doing something that's awesome? Now, you would stop doing a lift and replace it with another similar lift that accomplishes the same general goals, like one kind of press for another kind of press, if this exercise starts to do 3 other things which are not great. First of all, it's no longer grooving for you, and you're having trouble, like you're feeling a lot of force generation in the right direction. Like you do a set of deadlifts and you look at your training partner and you're like, something's off. And I feel like I'm not using my hips. I'm just really disconnected from the lift. That happens sometimes if you do a lift for too long, too much fatigue accumulates, so on and so forth. Number 2 reason to maybe consider trading a lift off for another. It's really tough on your joints and it zaps you at a central systemic level from being able to execute strength-wise in the rest of your program. Like if deadlifts take you 3 hours at some point and they're just ripping your lower back to shreds, not in the good way, and they leave you just completely drained for the rest of your program, maybe switching to deficit deadlifts or some kind of bent row or something else for a while, moving away from the conventional or classic deadlift might be a good idea if all the other factors make sense. And lastly, and this is the most obvious one, if a lift has plateaued, convincingly plateaued, you've gained no strength on it, maybe even lost a little, that sometimes happens, for over a month, maybe it's time to start thinking about the lift. Now notice no one of these really says just get rid of it, but if 2 or 3 of them are there and you have another lift that you can do that works really just as well or better, then it might be time to trade it off. So if your low bar squat is getting kind of stale on you, you don't have a powerlifting meet anytime soon, is it okay to try a high bar squat? Of course, and that's going to be awesome because it's going to develop the same general qualities, but do them much better and get you stronger, much faster, and more sustainably. Now, there's a timing component to this. We're going to cover this in a later video on actually phase potentiating to try to peak for a super performance at something like a powerlifting meet or a strongman meet. But generally speaking, in the beginning of one of those programs for a meet, you might do exercises that train mostly subsystems. For example, you do a lot of jam presses and skull crushers and pec flies and incline benches to train the muscles that will eventually power a big bench press, but you might not train the bench press itself because you just did a meet, you're kind of beat up, the bench is kind of stale for you, and you don't need to be good at benching anytime soon. You need to develop the underlying subsystems first. And then that might mean you bench very little or bench not at all. But as you near your 1RM testing date, whether it be just you want a 1RM max in the gym, or you're doing a powerlifting meet or a strongman meet or something like that, you do less and less of these subsystem or what are called assistance lifts and more of the actual core lifts that you're going to be testing yourself with. So the assistance work goes down, the core lift work goes up, and at the end, not only did you benefit from all that assistance work and it gave you a nice break from the core lifts, but you're the best possible at the core lifts when you're testing, having just trained them. Folks, give that some thought, and I'll see you next time for video number 2.